I've always been fascinated by the rich history of Bologna, especially its university, the oldest in the Western world. But I never imagined that pursuing my art history degree here would lead me to question everything I believed about the world. It was during my second year when I first noticed something odd about the sculpture in the university's botanical garden. The garden itself was a sanctuary for students, a quiet place to study or relax between classes. The sculpture, an ancient piece depicting a robed figure, had always been there, nestled among the carefully tended plants. I remember the day clearly. It was early autumn, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I was cutting through the garden on my way to class when I watched. I glanced around, thinking another student was nearby, but the garden was empty except for me and that statue. As I walked past, I could have sworn its eyes followed me. I shook it off, chalking it up to lack of sleep and too much espresso. But over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that sculpture. It wasn't just the eyes. Strange things started happening around campus, always when I was near that garden. My perfectly organized notes would be in disarray when I opened my bag. I'd trip over nothing, skinning my knees on the ancient cobblestones. One particularly memorable incident involved my laptop shutting down and losing an entire essay just as I was about to submit it, and of course, I was sitting on a bench near the damn statue when it happened. At first, I tried to rationalize it all. I was clumsy, distracted, overworked. But the incidents kept piling up, and they always seemed to revolve around that sculpture. I started avoiding the garden, taking the long way around campus. But even then, I'd catch glimpses of it out of the corner of my eye, that robed figure always seeming to be facing my direction, no matter where I stood. My friends started to notice something was wrong. "Chiara, you look exhausted," my roommate Elena said one evening. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, not sure how to explain without sounding crazy. I think I'm being followed," I finally said. Elena's eyes widened. "By who? Should we call the police?" No, I said quickly. "It's not a person. It's going to sound insane, but I think it's that old sculpture in the botanical garden." To her credit, Elena didn't laugh. She listened as I poured out the whole story, the feeling of being watched, the strange accidents, my growing paranoia. "Okay," she said when I finished. "I think we need to do some research." We spent the next few days digging through the university's archives, looking for any information about the sculpture. It wasn't easy. Records from that far back were spotty at best. But eventually, we found something. The sculpture, it turned out, had been donated to the university in the late 16th century by a wealthy alum. But here's the thing: it wasn't supposed to be of a robed figure. The original donation records described it as a sculpture of a young woman. "That doesn't make any sense," I said, staring at the faded document. "It's clearly a robed figure now." "How could it have changed?" Elena shrugged, looking uneasy. "Maybe the records are wrong." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were onto something. We kept digging, and eventually found a small note in the margin of an old ledger. It was barely legible, but what we could make out sent chills down my spine. "Sculpture causes misfortune. Move to garden." After that, the mentions of the sculpture in official records just stopped, as if the university had decided to pretend it didn't exist. I didn't know what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to go to the administration, but what would I say? That I thought an ancient statue was cursed and following me around? In the end, I decided to confront it head-on. One night, when the campus was quiet, I went back to the garden. The sculpture stood there, as it always had, its blank eyes seeming to stare right through me. "What do you want?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous, but desperate for answers. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so subtly I almost missed it, the statue's head tilted slightly to the side. Just a fraction of an inch, but enough that I was sure I hadn't imagined it. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, not stopping until I was safely back in my dorm room. Elena found me there, pale and shaking. "What happened?" she asked, alarmed. I told her everything. To my surprise, she believed me without question. "We need to tell someone," she said firmly. The next day, we went to Professor Bianchi, my art history advisor. I half expected him to dismiss us outright, but as I told my story, his face grew increasingly grave. "You're not the first," he said quietly when I finished. "There have been incidents over the years. Nothing concrete enough to take action, but whispers." He promised to look into it, to see if the sculpture could be moved or at least examined more closely. But universities move slowly, especially with matters like this. I'm still here, still studying. The sculpture is still in the garden. But now, when I walk past, I keep my eyes straight ahead. I don't look at it, and I try very hard not to think about whether it's looking at me. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder about that young woman the sculpture was supposed to depict. What happened to change it? And more importantly, is she still in there somewhere, watching us all through those stone eyes? If you are enjoying it, please consider subscribing and clicking the like button to support my channel. I still get goosebumps thinking about my first year at the University of Sydney. It was supposed to be an exciting new chapter in my life, but it turned into something I never could have imagined. I'm Mia, and I was 18 when I moved into the university's student housing. I was thrilled to be living on campus, even though I'd have to share a room. The residence hall was an old sandstone building, beautiful, but with a bit of a spooky vibe. My room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long corridor. On move-in day, I noticed there was only one bed made up. I asked the resident advisor about my roommate, and she checked her clipboard. "Oh, it looks like your roommate hasn't arrived yet," she said. "Her name's Sarah. I'm sure she'll be here soon." The first few days were a whirlwind of orientation activities and getting to know my floormates. I didn't think much about my absent roommate until about a week into the semester. That's when things started to get weird. It was late, maybe a.m., and I was up studying. Suddenly, I heard the door open. I looked up, expecting to finally meet Sarah, but no one was there. The door was still closed. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just tired. But then I heard footsteps. Soft, padding across the room. My heart started racing. "Hello?" I called out. No response. The footsteps stopped. I turned on all the lights, but the room was empty. This became a nightly occurrence. I'd hear the door, then footsteps, sometimes even the sound of books being moved or a chair scraping across the floor. But always when I looked, there was nothing. I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings make noises, right? Maybe it was just the pipes or the wind. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The sounds were too distinct, too purposeful. I started sleeping with the lights on, but that didn't help. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing right next to my bed. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even open my eyes. When I finally gathered the courage to look, there was no one there. I didn't want to seem crazy, so I didn't tell anyone at first. But after a few weeks, I couldn't take it anymore. I confided in my friend, Emma, who lived down the hall. She looked at me strangely and asked, "Mia, what roommate are you talking about?" You're in a single room." My blood ran cold. I insisted that I was supposed to have a roommate named Sarah. Emma suggested we talk to the RA. When we did, the RA looked confused. She pulled out the room assignments and showed me. I was indeed assigned to a single room. There was no Sarah. Desperate for answers, I went to the housing office. The woman there was helpful, but puzzled. She dug through some old files and then her face went pale. "Oh my," she said softly. "There was a Sarah assigned to that room. 5 years ago, she passed away before the semester started. Car accident." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. For weeks I'd been hearing, what? A ghost? The memory of a girl who never got to start her university life. I couldn't stay in that room. The university was understanding and moved me to a different dorm. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear footsteps or the sound of a door opening. I've tried to find out more about Sarah, but there's not much information available. Sometimes I wonder if she was just trying to experience the university life she never got to have. Other times, I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. As a graduate student in biochemistry at Tsinghua University, I deal with facts, data, and measurable outcomes. But what happened to me one night in the lab shook my beliefs to the core. My name is Liang, and I was working on my thesis project, which involved some time-sensitive experiments. It wasn't unusual for me to stay late, sometimes until the early hours of the morning. The lab was my second home, filled with the familiar hum of equipment and the faint smell of chemicals. That night, I was alone in the building, or so I thought. It was around a.m., and I was peering into a microscope when I felt a sudden chill. At first, I dismissed it as fatigue, or maybe the air conditioning acting up. But then I heard a faint shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I looked up, expecting to see a janitor, or maybe another student. Instead, what I saw made my blood run cold. In the corner of the lab, partially obscured by a large centrifuge, was a figure. It was translucent, with a faint bluish glow. I could make out the shape of a man wearing a lab coat, his face obscured by shadow. My heart began to race. I blinked hard, convinced I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. But when I opened my eyes, the figure was still there. It seemed to be examining something on one of the lab benches, its movements slow and deliberate. I wanted to run, to scream, but I found myself frozen in place. The figure turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its face. That's when I recognized him, Dr. Zhang, a researcher who had died in a lab accident 2 years ago. I had seen his picture in the hallway memorial. Dr. Zhang had been working on a groundbreaking experiment involving highly volatile compounds. Something went wrong, resulting in an explosion that took his life and injured several others. The incident had shaken the entire university community. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, Dr. Zhang's ghost, if that's what it was, moved towards the exact spot where the fatal accident had occurred. He seemed to be reenacting his final moments, reaching for something invisible, his movements becoming more frantic. Suddenly, all the equipment in the lab began to malfunction. Centrifuges whirred to life, computer screens flickered, and the lights started to flicker erratically. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath misting in the air. In that moment, my scientific mind grappled with what I was witnessing. Could this be some sort of mass hallucination triggered by stress and sleep deprivation? Was there a gas leak causing me to see things? But deep down, I knew this was something beyond rational explanation. Dr. Zhang's figure turned towards me, and I felt his gaze boring into me. There was a profound sadness in his eyes, mixed with what seemed like a warning. He raised his hand, pointing at something behind me. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, he was gone. The lab returned to normal as suddenly as it had changed. The equipment stopped, the lights stabilized, and the temperature gradually returned to normal. I stood there, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. I spent the next few hours and days unable to continue my work or leave the lab. When morning came, I finally gathered the courage to tell my supervisor about what I had seen. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss my story outright. Instead, he looked troubled and shared that other students had reported strange occurrences in the lab, though none as vivid as mine. In the days that followed, I dove into researching the accident that took Dr. Shang's life. I discovered that he had been trying to warn his colleagues about a flaw in the experimental design just before the explosion. His concerns had gone unheeded, with tragic consequences. This revelation led to a reinvestigation of the incident and a thorough review of lab safety protocols across the university. While no one else openly admitted to seeing Dr. Shang's ghost, the event sparked important conversations about lab safety and the responsibility we have towards our colleagues. Growing up in a small town in Connecticut, I never imagined I'd end up at Yale University, let alone become entangled in a ghost story that would haunt me for years to come. But that's exactly what happened during my sophomore year, back in 2018. I was in a Reeves, a 19-year-old English literature major, burning the midnight oil in Sterling Memorial Library. It was mid-October, and the air outside had turned crisp with autumn's chill. Inside, the library was a haven of warmth and quiet, filled with the comforting smell of old books and polished wood. That night, I was researching for a paper on Gothic literature in the library's restricted section. The restricted section was housed in a separate wing, accessible only to students with special permission. It was a maze of tall, dark wooden shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly, holding rare and valuable books. As I wound my way through the stacks, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, I felt a strange prickle at the back of my neck. You know that feeling when you think someone's watching you? It was like that, but more intense. I turned around, half expecting to see another student, but the aisle behind me was empty. Shaking off the feeling, I continued my search. That's when I saw him for the first time. At the end of the aisle, partially obscured by a shelf, stood an elderly man. He was dressed in an old-fashioned tweed suit, complete with a body and round spectacles. His wispy white hair was neatly combed, and he was intently studying a book in his hands. I blinked, surprised to see someone else in this secluded area so late at night. "Excuse me," I called out softly, not wanting to startle him. But he didn't react. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed something odd. The light seemed to pass right through him, as if he wasn't fully there. My heart began to race. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was hallucinating from too much caffeine and too little sleep. When I looked again, he was gone. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to process what I'd just seen. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me after hours of reading about ghosts and ghouls? Over the next few weeks, I saw him several more times. Always in the restricted section, always alone, always engrossed in a book. Each time, he would vanish if I tried to approach or speak to him. I started to dread going to the library, but my research demanded it. One evening, I mustered up the courage to ask the librarian about him. "Oh, you must mean Professor Ellington," she said with a smile. "He practically lived in the restricted section when he taught here. Passed away about 30 years ago." My blood ran cold. "But I've seen him," I blurted out. Recently, the librarian's smile faltered. "Dear, Professor Ellington died in 1988. You couldn't have seen him." I tried to explain, but she just looked at me with concern and suggested I get some rest. I realized then that no one would believe me. I was on my own. As the semester wore on, I became increasingly anxious. I couldn't concentrate on my studies, jumping at every shadow and sound in the library. My friends noticed my distraction, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. Who would believe that I was being haunted by the ghost of a long-dead professor? One night, working late again, I saw him materialize at the end of an aisle. This time, instead of disappearing, he turned and looked directly at me. His eyes were sad, almost pleading. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed to a specific shelf before fading away. Heart pounding, I approached the shelf. There, I found an old leather-bound journal. It was Professor Allington's personal diary. As I read through it, I discovered entries about his groundbreaking research on a rare medieval text research that had never been published. Suddenly, it all made sense. The ghost wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to finish his life's work. With trembling hands, I took the journal to the head librarian the next day. At first skeptical, she eventually recognized the importance of the discovery. The university launched an investigation into Professor Allington's unfinished research, bringing closure to his academic legacy. After that, I never saw the ghostly professor again. But the experience changed me profoundly. I became fascinated with the intersection of literature and the supernatural, eventually writing my thesis on ghostly encounters in academic settings. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of those encounters in the restricted section. Sometimes, when I'm in a quiet library, I'll feel that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. And for a moment, I'll wonder if Professor Allington is still out there, guiding another unsuspecting student towards a hidden truth. I don't expect anyone to believe my story, but I know what I saw, and I know the impact it had on my life. It taught me that there are mysteries in this world that defy explanation, and that sometimes the line between the living and the dead is thinner than we'd like to believe. I've always been a bit of an observer. It's probably why I ended up majoring in journalism at Columbia University. But I never expected my keen eye to lead me down such a chilling path. It was the fall semester of my junior year when I first noticed him. A young guy, maybe 19 or 20, with a mop of curly brown hair and thick-rimmed glasses. He was always alone, wandering around campus with a lost look on his face. At first, I didn't think much of it. Columbia is a big place, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But as the weeks went by, something started to feel off. I'd see him in the oddest places at the strangest times. Once, I spotted him standing in the middle of Low Plaza at AM, just staring up at the stars. Another time, he was sitting on the steps of Butler Library, flipping through a textbook that looked way out of date. What really got me, though, was his clothes. They were old. Like decades old. We're talking high-waisted pants, a button-up shirt with a wide collar, and these chunky shoes that looked straight out of the 1970s. It was way beyond any retro fashion trend I'd seen. I started asking around, trying to figure out who this guy was. But no one seemed to know him. My roommate Jake thought I was losing it. "Dude, you're spending too much time cooped up in the library," he said, rolling his eyes. "You're seeing things." But I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was something about this guy that just didn't add up. One night, I was working late in the journalism school's computer lab. It was nearly midnight, and I was the only one there. Or so I thought. I felt a chill run down my spine and looked up to see the mystery guy standing in the doorway, just watching me. My heart started racing. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need help with something?" He didn't respond, just kept staring with those sad, lost eyes. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. I jumped up to follow him, but by the time I got to the hallway, he was gone, vanished into thin air. That's when I knew I had to dig deeper. I spent the next few weeks combing through old yearbooks in the university archives. And that's where I found him. In a yearbook from 1978, there he was, same curly hair, same glasses. The caption read, "Thomas Larson, sophomore." My hands were shaking as I showed the yearbook to the archivist, an older woman named Mrs. Patel. Her face went pale when she saw the photo. "Oh my," she whispered. "I remember this case. It was my first year working here." She told me that Thomas had vanished without a trace in the spring of 1979. There was a massive search, but they never found him. It was like he'd just disappeared. Some said he'd had a mental breakdown and run away, Mrs. Patel said, her voice low. Others thought something more sinister had happened, but no one ever knew for sure. I left the archives with my mind reeling. Had I really been seeing the ghost of a student who disappeared over 40 years ago? It seemed impossible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was trying to tell me something. For the next few months, I threw myself into researching Thomas's disappearance. I pored over old newspaper articles, police reports, anything I could get my hands on. But the more I learned, the more questions I had. I kept seeing Thomas around campus, always at a distance. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of him standing under a tree or walking across the quad. But whenever I tried to approach him, he'd vanish. One night in late April, almost exactly 44 years after Thomas had disappeared, I was walking back to my dorm after a late study session. The campus was quiet, a light fog rolling in from the Hudson River. That's when I saw him again, standing by the sundial in the middle of campus. This time, he didn't disappear. As I got closer, I could see the sadness in his eyes, the confusion on his face. He looked right at me, and for a moment, I swear I could see right through him. "Thomas?" I said softly. "Thomas Larson." He nodded slowly, then pointed towards the east side of campus. Without a word, he turned and started walking. I followed, my heart pounding. He led me to an old building that was scheduled for renovation. Then, just like that, he was gone. But something told me to keep going. I found a way inside through a loose board and started exploring with the flashlight on my phone. In a dusty corner of the basement, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small room, hidden behind an old bookcase. And inside, well, let's just say I finally knew what had happened to Thomas Larson. I called the police immediately. The investigation that followed was intense. Turns out, Thomas had stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see back in '79, and someone had made sure he'd never tell. They identified his remains through DNA testing. After 44 years, Thomas Larson was finally able to go home. I haven't seen Thomas since that night. Part of me is relieved, but another part, well, I can't help but wonder if there are other stories out there, other secrets hidden in the shadows of this old campus. My name's Ryan, and I'm a junior studying engineering. This past fall, I made a discovery that still keeps me up at night. It was a crisp October evening when my buddy Jake and I decided to check out the rumors about the old steam tunnels running under the university. We'd heard whispers about their existence, but most students treated them like urban legends. Armed with flashlights and a rough map we'd pieced together from online forums, we found an unlocked maintenance door near the diag. The musty smell hit us as soon as we stepped inside. The air was thick and damp, making it hard to breathe. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint and rusted pipes running along the walls. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. "This is insane," Jake whispered, his voice echoing slightly. "How far do you think these go?" I shrugged, trying to hide my growing unease. "Let's find out." We walked for what felt like hours, marking our path with chalk to avoid getting lost. The further we went, the more oppressive the silence became. The only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the darkness. That's when I first noticed something odd. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, gone as soon as I turned to look. I chalked it up to shadows playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't alone. "Did you see that?" I asked Jake, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, looking confused. "See what?" Before I could answer, a cold breeze swept through the tunnel, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was impossible. We were deep underground with no ventilation. Yet I could feel it, carrying with it the faint smell of cleaning products. We pressed on, but the strange occurrences continued. Our flashlights began to flicker intermittently, plunging us into moments of total darkness. In those brief seconds, I swore I could hear the shuffling of footsteps, always just behind us. "Jake," I said, my voice trembling, "I think we should head back." He nodded, looking pale in the dim light. We turned around, following our chalk marks back the way we came. That's when we saw him. At the end of the tunnel stood a figure, barely visible in the gloom. He was an older man, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned janitor's uniform. But there was something off about him. His edges seemed blurred, and I could almost see through him to the wall behind. Jake let out a strangled gasp. "What the hell is that?" The figure turned slowly, revealing a face etched with sadness and pain. His eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of despair wash over me. I knew, without understanding how, that this man had died here, alone in the darkness. We ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. The sound of our panicked breathing and pounding footsteps echoed off the walls as we sprinted back toward the entrance. I could feel the temperature dropping around us, the air becoming thick and heavy. Just as we reached the maintenance door, I felt something brush against my back. A whisper, so faint I could barely make it out, reached my ears. "Help me." We burst out into the cool night air, gasping and shaking. Jake and I didn't speak as we made our way back to our dorm. It wasn't until the next day that we began to process what we'd seen. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started researching the tunnel system's history. That's when I found the article from 1973. A janitor named Frank Milligan had been working in the tunnels when a section collapsed. By the time they found him, it was too late. I haven't been back to the tunnels since, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the faint echo of footsteps and the lingering scent of cleaning products. And I wonder if Frank is still waiting for someone to help him find his way out of the darkness. Thank you for listening. Now try to sleep.